me know. So Hendrick Fisher was born in the 1600s. He comes over as a child to New Jersey. And while he's here, he's actually interesting because he participates in the First Great Awakening. He comes of age just as the First Great Awakening's happening. And I don't talk a lot about the Great Awakenings, but the First Great Awakening was happening in the 1720s into the 1730s and even into the 1740s. And Hendrick Fisher gets a mentor, and his mentor's name is Theodorus Jacobus Frelinghuysen, I believe is how it's pronounced. He was a Dutch Reformed Church pastor who was really not one of the leading Great Awakening sermon givers, pastors in the colonies, but he was the leading one in central New Jersey, which was important because, well, today's hero, Fisher, grew up in New Jersey and came of age there, as I said, was mentored by Frelinghuysen. And during this time, he became what was known as a helper. And this is a little bit of a controversial position because at first the helper was just supposed to help out the pastor when he needed help. But eventually this position grew to giving sermons and overseeing the church. And people were a little curious about the power that this person had in the community, especially with the church, especially during the Great Awakening when religious revivalism was so important at the time, that how could this guy who's not a pastor be giving the sermons and all of this? And it was a little controversial, but though he made some enemies, it ended up making Fisher rise from really a nobody farmer, artisan in his community to one of the most powerful men in New Jersey. Eventually, he's elected in the 1740s to the Colonial Assembly. However, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding about exactly when he became a naturalized citizen, and he is not allowed to take his seat, though 5 years later, he is cleared as a naturalized citizen, and what do you know? He becomes a member of the Colonial Assembly, and this is in the 1740s, and he would be in the Colonial Assembly all the way through till it becomes a state assembly. Actually, where I came up upon Fisher's name is he was a delegate from New Jersey to the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, which we know was an early part of the grievance filings against Great Britain, a decade before the war actually broke out. He goes back to New Jersey. He becomes one of the most important people in the Jersey Colonial Assembly. He gets appointed to the local committee of correspondence. By the time of the Lexington and Concord breaks out, Fisher is already on the Committee of Safety, and he is actually chosen as the first president of the New Jersey Provincial Congress. Again, at this point, he's already in his late 70s by the time he is elected to the New Jersey as president of the Provincial Congress. And the Provincial Congress was essentially the shadow government that took over between ousting Royal Governor William Franklin and creating a state government. Now, he's only in this position for about 6 months, and then he's, he's in his 80s by this point, and he resigns because he's tired and he's a little bit older, and a much younger person takes over as president, but essentially governor of revolutionary New Jersey, though the people there say, well, you're not going anywhere, and they immediately elect Fisher as vice president of the state of New Jersey because he was so important to New Jersey as both a colony and now as a revolutionary state. Now, he only sticks around for about a year and a half, and he ends up going back home, though he has to flee his home because it is taken for a brief time by the British. And when General Howe, the British general, ends up giving blanket pardons, saying, anyone who wants to leave the Patriots, we will forgive you if you come fight for us against the rebels, there are certain people specifically excluded from this. They are called arch traitors, and Hendrick Fisher was an arch traitor in the eyes of the crown, and therefore would never be forgiven. Fortunately for him, he does not. America wins, although sadly, as I said, he was already getting into his 80s at this point, and Hendrick Fisher ends up passing away in either 1778 or 1779. Surprisingly, we don't know exactly when he died. There was some controversy about the date on his grave, which is surprising. And I didn't mention this in the beginning, but Hendrick Fisher, we don't know a lot about his early life either. So considering he was at the Stamp Act Congress and the first president of revolutionary New Jersey, we know surprisingly little about this gentleman. It's really, really interesting. So that's what we know of the life of Stamp Act Congress delegate Hendrick Fisher.